the hope remains that we can go beyond human capabilities, and that's probably done with other technologies than the human works, right? There's so much pain and suffering in the world, right? And we have an obligation to reduce that if we can build systems, even if they are different than us and their intelligences are different than ours. If we can deploy them to help patients, we are morally obliged to do so.
I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Thomas Fuchs, a pioneering scientist in the field of computational pathology. In his groundbreaking specialty, Thomas uses artificial intelligence to analyze images of tissue samples to identify disease, recommend treatment, and predict outcome. Dr. Fuchs was appointed co-director of the Hasso-Platter Institute for Digital Health at Mount Sinai, making him Dean of Artificial Intelligence and Human Health. He also serves as professor of computational pathology and computer science at the Econ School of Medicine. I'm fortunate to have you here. Thank you very much for joining me.
Vahe, thank you so much for the introduction, very kind one, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Just really by chance, I was reading some newspaper about artificial intelligence, and I saw your picture and some quotes. I don't know if this quote is exactly from you or not, but it said something interesting that I want to elaborate on. It said that physicians will have a deep holistic view of patients that will dramatically enhance their ability to predict, diagnose, treat, and prevent illnesses. And the first question I want to start with is exactly this. So this is a very Silicon Valley view on reality, is that the more data, the better, predictions are, which usually is true. But sometimes there's also this idea of knowing too much of a person could lead you to a wrong assumption about this, right? So if I take an MRI of a person that is healthy, I might find something that is not perfectly normal, but and it might lead to wrong decisions. How do you think about this?
Personally, I'm completely opposed to that view for several reasons. So, I mean, first of all, from a purely scientific point of view, right, reducing your information input can't possibly lead to a better outcome. So then what you could argue is that there are so many outside constraints because of processes, procedures, and the healthcare system in general, that more information would lead, for example, to overtreatment. But in general, you should never shoot the messenger, but deal with the message, right? So if you think about early detection and screening, right, every time in every medical discipline, every time there were new technologies, be it blood-based, CT-based, pathology-based, variables-based, there was always then the initial reaction from some people, oh my God, if we find more disease, then there will be more treatment. It's too expensive or we overtreat. And in all these cases, physicians adopted over time. And of course, especially if you think about cancer, often that's difficult, a difficult conversation. But prostate cancer is a good example. So even there, patients in general accept that watchful waiting is a way to handle cancer for prostate cancer in many situations. So you have very, very early indolent lesions maybe, and you would actually wait and monitor them. And doing that is for sure better than doing nothing, right? Only out of fear that you would have an unnecessary prostatectomy. So it puts more burden, of course, on the treating physician to integrate these informations and come to the right decision, and also how to communicate that to the patient. But in general, as you know, we are so deep on the other side of that scenario, right? That we have patients dying every single day because there wasn't an early detection, because cancer was detected too late, disease wasn't detected, treatable disease wasn't detected, right? So I'm much, much more concerned about the other end of that spectrum, that we go through life and fall victim to disease that's preventable.
You touched upon prostate cancer. I think I read your paper about terabyte scale deep multiple instance learning for the classification and localization in pathology, I think, right?
Mhm.
There you introduced a novel technique rather than having the slices pixel-wise correctly labeled. You cut it into smaller pieces and just gave a binary information like is in this quadrant basically a cancerous thing or not, right? And then I think you used convolutional neural networks, several different networks to do this with obviously very great success there. But your latest research was now about language models, right? I think you switched to keyword optimized template insertion for clinical note classification, right?
So what we did back in the day in 2019 with multiple instance learning, that was more or less the first time that we could build systems at scale because we didn't need manual annotations, and we could actually learn directly from the pathology reports. So that was weakly supervised information. You can see it as intermediate step between strong supervised systems and unsupervised or self-supervised systems these days. And you're right, these were CNNs, and we trained models with up to 60,000 patients, and that led to the first and only FDA approved AI in pathology. But these days, we are using VITs for the computer vision task as well. And the fabulous paper you're referring, that's actually not my work. That's a work of a fabulous postdoc of mine, Eugenia Aleva. She's also an MD, and she uses these techniques we are developing in women's health. And she uses large language models to actually go through the Mount Sinai's 10 million patient records to build cohorts and analyze correlations to disease, especially for women with severe menstrual pain. And that's a very good example for a completely underserved condition where AI and new technologies can actually help the patients to, first of all, find them, then characterize it and classifies them. But in pathology, it's still vision-based. We have combinations between large language models and large vision models, but the scale is a little bit larger. So we are now actually at petabyte scale already, not only terabyte.
Isn't it interesting that if you look at these and language models, we can, I think, safely say that we are in the era of computationally universal AI models, right? So you can almost do anything with this ChatGPT. Yes, I understand you are, fine tuning and doing other things with it, but in reality, it is pretty much universal, right? But when you think about vision-based tasks, right? So if you take a CNN, then you trained it for a specific task, it can only do that task. It is not universal in that sense. Right? I think we achieved this universality in these language models just by chance. It wasn't like planned. We didn't know that if we train it with basically the internet, this will come out. So 2 questions. Do you think that there is a viable path to AGI, like general intelligence, pretty soon with these language models? And do you think that a combination, as you said yourself, between backbone being a large language model and then the encoder being vision, can also help us to achieve better results or even universality in vision-based tasks?
The first one is a very interesting philosophical question, why we are seemingly so much further ahead with large language models than with vision models. Right? And one argument that could be made is that language is still something that's produced by us humans, right? It's produced by our brains. While, for example, a natural image, be it a natural scene, or be it a microscopic image of cancer, is produced by nature, by physics plus nature. And the space of configurations is nearly infinitely larger than the space of configurations you would have in language. Right? Our brain is still much more limited in producing language, and there's obviously so much structure in language that it can be captured by these models. While if you think about the biological process that produces your cancer image, right? All the genes, proteins, all these interactions with the physical world, the chemical interactions, and so forth. That space is so much larger. And I think that explains the gap. Um, if you think back into in machine learning, the first successes were in games, of course, right? Like chess and Go, which are very structured games, that were invented by humans, constraints that were set by humans, and they can be brute forced, like in chess, or also solved in creative ways, like in Go. But these are very constrained systems. And language, as it turns out, is not that broad as the whole physical world, right? And I think that's why we are more successful in language.
To be honest, I always um, try to argue that, or thought that it is because in language we have, especially with transformers, a positional encoding, right? And in our brain has a positional encoding for what we are seeing, right? Which I think 2014, the Nobel Prize went to people who found the grid cells in the brain. But AI doesn't have it, right? So there's lacking something there. But the way you think about it with the space of possibilities, you're absolutely right, right? It's like infinitely larger almost than would have with language. Yes. But that also answers actually the second question almost already. So because then following your thought, it would be very hard to achieve this universality in vision-based tasks, correct?
Yes, I mean it always, as we all know, there's no really good definition of AGI. There's no good definition of intelligence. I mean that's actually an interesting sign of our times, that all these expressions, right, intelligence, sense, sentience, consciousness, everything the different disciplines came up with, all these definitions are out of the window, right? And that's great, right? That means progress. That means we have to think about that very deeply. And it depends very much how you define AGI, how you would plot a path to it, right? So if you go back to medicine, of course, if you think about the space of radiology or pathology, I mean that's of course a space that's outside of the human experience, right? And the language we put on top of the things we saw through microscopes for a few hundred years ago, these are just very limited um, expressions for the patterns we see through our eyes, right? And you see that often in the ways physicians also describe images. These are often correlates to the natural world, right? So these cells look like they were in single file, like humans would march in single file, or these look like this or that, and they're also these comps to what we see in the natural world. And there's clearly that gap, and that of course also shows us that we can go much further if we can go beyond what we as humans can just describe there. So the bridging the gap from the microscopic world to the macroscopic world, that seems to be very much out of scope for an vision AGI system. So I agree with you there as well. Um, but without doubt, the combination of both is certainly helpful in many aspects. Um, but the jury is for sure out how far you can go with the current methodology, or if you need completely new things. And again, it depends really on the definition of AGI.
I agree. It's of course very hard to define these things, like even consciousness, right? I mean, there's so many scientists that are still, debating if there is even consciousness or not, and then how would you define it? And recently, I went back and read Nagler's think about the bat, and I realized that if yes, it's very easy if you, how it is to be like a stone. Yes, you can't feel like how it is like a stone, but actually you could probably feel like how it is to be AI, how it is to be ChatGPT might actually be something that you could, empathize with, right? I mean, I didn't go very deep into this, but in reality, I think it's very hard questions because we just can't define it yet.
Oh, I'm sure. I very often can do that. Most of the time, I do not know how I'm going to end a sentence when I start it. So that's very similar to this system.
Exactly. Exactly. Very interesting. So, and then one thing that I mean, you have done really groundbreaking work, and basically because of not having enough data, right? And when we talk about data, in this case, it is really probably about labeled data, right? but generally the amount of data in healthcare should be humongous, right? I mean, there's lots of data there. And then it's about techniques to find so that you don't need to label it like the ones that you have found. But there comes a second aspect to it, which is pretty unique to this industry, is of course all these ethical things that come to this,
Mhm.
right? Because you have very high ethical standards. Obviously, you should. How do you see AI and ethics play with each other?
So first on the data side, there's of course different kinds of data. So for example, in pathology, Mount Sinai is digitizing 1.5 million slides per month. Page and MSK digitized nearly 6 million slides. And there we are building models from 50 billion images. So these are self-supervised models, 50 billion images from 4 million slides. So that's 10 times more data than all of Netflix, if you would count the pixels of all your favorite shows and videos. So there's a lot of that data, and you can train that in a self-supervised way, quite similar than you train actually large language models. But then on the other hand, what's super rare is, for example, outcome data of trials of new drugs, of new compounds. If you have a phase 2 trial or similar, you might have just 50 patients or 100 patients, right? So there it's really, really scarce. And that's where these large foundation models will have a huge impact, because like in language, you can do few shot learning and you hit the ground running with your large models. Um, so back to the ethics side, and that's of course absolutely crucial in healthcare. The first thing I also did when I joined Mount Sinai was I initiated the AI ethics initiative at Sinai that now grew to a large committee that has oversight of everything, not only what's done internally but also the tools that are used externally, brought in from externally. But what's also important to understand in healthcare, and that very often, at least from my machine learning colleagues, is not seen, is that ethics in medicine is of course a very old field. And you have bioethicists and bioethics groups in academic medical centers, universities, and healthcare systems since a long time, and who do ethics in healthcare for decades. Right? And a lot of the questions we are concerned about using AI, so for example, equity, right, access to these tools, costs of these tools, these are questions that were or are dealt with bioethics experts since a very long time. So it's very important when you build these ethics groups is that you have a mixture of both, right? You really need bioethicists who know what they're doing, how the field goes, what has happened in the past, what worked, what not worked. People who do public health, for example, as well. And then you need computer scientists who actually know how the sausage is really made, right? Because a lot of fears, of course, come from the fact that people don't understand how it works, and then they overestimate it, have some magic fantasies about AI, and then they fall back into the science fiction tropes they saw as kids when they saw some of my favorite movies from my Austrian compatriot. And so you need these groups to combine all of that to be effective. And then you have to prove out that systems are safe, effective, equitable, and that they're used in an ethical way. And in healthcare, that's of course key. And there's also space for regulation, of course, in healthcare, and it's a regulated space. And the FDA, I think, is doing a good job. They also try to crack down on loopholes that still exist, that are used actually to field AI these days in healthcare, where probably there should be oversight. So medicine and healthcare is very different to the the, let's say, world outside, because it's a regulated space.
And I feel like, I mean, you pointed out the probably the easiest one, right? Like justice, like equity is probably the easiest to achieve of the four principles, right? But if you think about autonomy and non-maleficence, they are like constantly debates which one is more important, right? Like, for
Mhm,
example, killing myself, right? I have a
mhm.
disease, I want to kill myself, right? Does a Can a doctor help me or not, right? It's against non-maleficence, but it is my autonomy, right? So there are lots of things where it gets into conflict. And I feel like another area of problems could be the explainability of AI models, right? Because we can think of AI also in a sense of that it is a representation of data in a different form. But the problem is it is a representation in a different form that is not explainable to you or not necessarily explainable. So meaning if I say you will not be the recipient of this kidney because AI told me, that might not be enough because I can't really explain it, right? Do you share that kind of problems?
So the first one you touched upon, non-maleficency and autonomy. Again, that's an old one. That's also, of course, has a lot of cultural implications. And the example you brought is handled differently in Switzerland, for example, where I did my PhD, than it's handled in Austria, for example, or in the US, of course. And again, these questions get a new spin through AI, but are not so fundamentally different. And important to note that, of course, these days, AI, all the tools that are out there, they are not run the tools themselves are not run in an autonomous way, right? These are decision support systems that the physician makes the final call. So regarding explainability, so I think that's a very, very interesting and important topic, because if you look at the field, people sometimes take very extreme positions. Right? I think it's better now, but looking back just 2 years, and people were pushing actually for the UN guidelines to even add explainability as a moral necessity, right? As it would be immoral if something is not explainable, right? So this is a very drastic view of the world. And I'm very critical of that, because think about healthcare today. So put AI aside. Think about anesthesia, right? Propofol is essential medicine. It puts you in anesthesia. It's used a million times every single day. It saves millions of people every single day. And we have not the slightest clue how it works.
How it works.
We don't know how it turns out of the consciousness. There are plenty of hypotheses. We just don't know. So there's zero explainability there. I mean, same thing actually with aspirin, but propofol, of course, has a bigger impact. And the same is true with many of these medicines, right? And it would be absolutely immoral to take these medicines away only because we humans don't understand them. So what do you do now, right? And the way to work in that scenario is to have trials in the medical scenario or an AI experimental setup that prove that these tools or drugs are safe and effective. And propofol is safe and effective for humans. And that's why it should be used, right? There's an obligation for us to use that. And I think that's also the way we're going to go with AI in some areas, right? So these days, the systems are still most of the time explainable to a large degree. So while they are very complex, for example, our cancer systems that just point out where the cancer is. And then the pathologist can look at, oh, yes, it's there. I would have missed it. Thank you. It's great, fabulous. But it really helps, right? But we are also building biomarkers that predict response to treatment, and they take very complex patterns into account that humans have not seen or realized before. Then you can point these patterns out, and often humans can see, oh, interesting. So that configuration of cells and vessels obviously leads to a better response. And now I know that pattern as well, and I could do it as a human. But it's easy to see that if you go further, just a little bit, a few years, these systems will be much more complex than our brains could actually handle them, right? And then you're in a scenario where you might have systems, you will have systems that will significantly help patients, but we can't understand it. And the question is always also, if you talk about explainability, it's always explainability for whom, right? Explainability for the computer scientists who build it, explainability for the subspecialized MD who works only on that cancer type, explainability for the nurse who's using the algorithm, the technician, or explainability for the patient, right? And that's very often glossed over, right? That's not the case. So the key here is also, like with propofol and other drugs, is that we have a system that regulates the use of these tools, that has to prove out in studies, for example, with the FDA, that they are safe, effective, and equitable. And if that's the case, and there's clear benefit for patient care, then they should be used, even if our feeble, wet brains are not able to comprehend them.
Very, very, very good point. I actually can't agree more. I absolutely agree with you. I actually would add to this even that human decisions are not necessarily explainable either, because
Correct.
just because I am explaining it doesn't mean that that was the reason why I made this decision, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Daniel Kahneman has shown in numerous examples that, we have lots of cognitive biases and we have no idea why we came up with this decision. Actually, of course, if you ask, then something will come out, but that
Yeah.
something is not necessarily the truth, right? So if even humans cannot explain their decisions, why would we assume that it's a necessity for AI doing this? I agree
It's
with
more like a large language model response, right? You always get an explanation, but they might differ drastically
absolutely
depending
correct.
on the time of day. And a lot of disciplines, especially in medicine, are very empirical. Pathology is a good one, right? If you took the best medical student, for example, at Mount Sinai, and that person would learn by heart every single pathology book out there, they would still be a very, very poor pathologist. Because again, language is so limiting. Pathologists have to go through tens of thousands of cases with their peers in joint sign-out to learn the pattern recognition capability in our human brains to actually be a good pathologist. And then very often the verbal explanations are just too limiting, right? If verbal explanations would have worked in that field, then the rule-based expert systems of the 80s would actually brought AGI. But of course they did not, right? And your point is a very, very good one. And in contrast to artificial neural networks, where we can investigate every single neuron, you can't cut open a human brain to actually find out how the decision was made.
And we are learning every day something new, right, from the brain. It's not like that we actually understand how our brain works. I think even in the last couple of years, there's still a debate going on of the role of glial cells in terms of neurotransmitters, right?
Mhm.
It's not clear how these mechanisms work, and so I think that makes, of course, sense that we can't understand these language models either.
But that's why these times are so exciting, because we can build artificial systems that often show capabilities we historically associated with high intelligence, right? And we can investigate them. So building AI will help us better understand also how our brain works, or how our decision making works. And yeah, it is exciting that some of the old definitions are thrown out now and rethought.
That's true. I experienced this in my life, not a second time. The first time was with cryptocurrencies, because when blockchain came and then Bitcoin came, it was debated, is it a currency or not? And for a very long time, economists couldn't even agree what is a currency.
Mhm.
Because you don't think about it if you don't need to think about it all the
Right.
time. And even if you go back in time, the definitions of what a currency is very, very different from Marx, Keynes, Ricardo, Adam Smith, had all different definitions about this, right? So it took us 5 years to settle this, and it will take us a couple of years probably to settle it here. But at the end, yes, you're right, it advances us, and it moves us forward. You touched upon a very interesting point when you said, like, um, it's also about a tool for the physician, right? At the end of the day, so basically brings us back to this concept of hybrid intelligence, like combining the intelligence of AI with those of a human. And I think the important part here is that you end up with a better decision that wouldn't be possible without the AI or without the human. So neither one of those can alone achieve to that point, right? And that is, as you pointed out yourself, maybe even an obligation to use it, because we can help more people with this. How do you think about this concept of hybrid intelligence? Do you think it's going to be a long lasting phase now, where it's always about this combination of these two? Or do you see that AI will be advancing in some areas, right? Probably more language-based areas, so much that that the human just won't be necessary anymore.
Again, so in healthcare, we will be in that hybrid situation for a very long time for a lot of reasons. First of all, as you very well pointed out before, all the systems that are used in practice these days are narrow AI systems. So the fusion doesn't happen in systems yet, and it's such a complex interaction between different system and a lot of different people and experiences, that there is of course a role for a physician to amalgate all that information that comes in. But they will have, and already do in some areas, have these fabulous tools that just give them more information about the patient. And it's what I meant also with that initial quote, to get a holistic view about the patient, is because you're going to have these pathology systems that talk about the morphology, and then the large language models that look back in time and all the doctor reports and extract the information there, and then liquid systems. And all these information will be integrated to give a better view about the patients. But these days, of course, these systems are also limited. That's why they have, if they are approved or cleared by the FDA, they have clear indications in which situations they only should be used. And there's all decisions by the humans and physicians to use them. Um, but in some areas, of course, um, it could make sense to go more an automated route, especially also to, for example, expand access to health. Again, think of pathology. There is the number of pathologists is going down everywhere in the world, in the US as well. The number of cancer cases goes up, the complexity goes up. So there's a significant gap between actually physicians who can provide the service and patients who need it. And so just to keep the standard of care, you're going to need AI. And then if you go beyond, of course, the US or Europe, there are many areas in the world where you only have one or two pathologists for the whole country, right? They are completely underserved. And that's a very good example where AI can lead truly to the democratization of access to healthcare. So not everybody can afford to come to Mount Sinai, right? But if you can train systems based on the knowledge of these ivory tower academic medical centers, and then you can deploy it in the community, in rural areas across the US, or, for example, really in the developing world where you wouldn't have access, then that you have enormous impact of democratization access to that. And in these scenarios, of course, there has to be more autonomy because there are just not enough physicians there. And it will be more, so the human input will be more again in these gray areas where you bring all the information together, not so much in a very single task where you have a hybrid system. So think of chess, of course, right? For decades, we had, many of us had that anthropocentric view and said, oh, a combination of a chess program and a human is always better, right? Because the human brings some creativity and some esoteric views of the chessboard that will help. Of course, that's not the case anymore, right? Humans can't contribute anything anymore to chess, right? It's the other way around, right? Chess players pick rules.
Exactly. So I started playing chess very late in my life, and you know, if you go back and look at all chess players, moves are very natural. But then in the last 10 years, they do fantastic moves that you think like, I mean, how would you even come up with this? And then you realize that it's Fritz or other chess programs that came up with this move, and then they memorized it. Yes, you absolutely have this thing, and that I again I can't agree more with you. I teach at a university, and I say to my students, if you're going to read 500 pages, it's better to read 50 pages of 10 books than 500 pages of one book right now, because we need range rather than depth.
Right.
Because in depth, AI will beat us, but in range, we are actually contributing a lot in the combination of these things together.
Yes.
That is a very, very interesting concept. And one thing we didn't actually touch upon, and I think it's a very important part of AI too, is what AI does to research in the medical field in the sense of drug discovery, or now, CRISPR-Cas9 and other things that are now possible, and how AI is contributing to this. I mean, I think you obviously know, I can't estimate the impact very well, but what DeepMind did with protein folding, I'm sure has some kind of impact to drug discovery, right?
Mhm.
And then how do you think there is AI going to help to advance this field?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a drastic way, I mean, the AlphaFold, the next version just announced at JP Morgan, a collaboration with another DeepMind spin out with pharma to actually push that forward. There's so much more that can be done. And that's also what Eric Schmidt called not digital for digital, but digital for the material world, right? And it goes into beyond, for example, of course, proteins and so forth. You can go into material sciences, right? And there we'll just see an explosion of new materials or new compounds in healthcare and so forth. And then we of course have to sort them through. In healthcare, of course, you always have at one point you can accelerate research for sure, and especially early research. But as soon as you have to go in human trials, you are just limited by the timeline, because then you're back on human timelines, of course, right? And of scale. So you will only have 50, 100 patients in these early trials. So that's something that will be harder to be sped up, but we might be able to do that with better compounds. We have a higher likelihood to actually benefit patients than we did in the past. So that's a very exciting space. But it goes beyond that. It actually goes into mathematics and logic, right? These areas are very, very interesting ones where you can go with these systems. And then, of course, what we do in oncology and pathology is looking for new patterns that can better predict outcome for patients, stratify patients. There are we often talk about prostate and breast and lung, the big cancers, but 50% of cancers are rare cancers by definition. So if you're inflicted by cancer, you can have a coin flip if you have one of the big ones where there are a lot of choices of treatment, or one of the rare ones where there are none. And what we also try to do is, for example, use these systems for cholangiocarcinoma, bile duct cancer, terrible disease where there's not so much out there. And I think that's also a beautiful aspect of AI, that you can now start, especially with these large foundation models and few-shot learning, start addressing issues of the rarer diseases, right?
And I mean, if you think about the disease, right, especially cancer, but also other diseases, and we classify it as a cancer, right? I get it. But actually, the mechanism and the reason for it might be very different, even for the same cancer in a patient, right? So
Of course, yes.
you could actually, with targeted medicine, like if you look at it as a specific instance of whatever without classifying it, and then find targeted treatment for that specific instance, is probably also a field where AI, without AI actually impossible, and with AI maybe possible and revolutionary, right? Because then
That's
very
the
targeted.
promise. That's the age-old promise of personalized medicine. And AI helps us make a headway in that area, because you now have the computational and statistical capabilities to tailor treatment and treatment decisions much more to a patient than you could in the past.
Yes, this is very interesting. Let me ask you, I know we're almost out of time, but let me just ask you one more question, because that
Sure.
is the thing, as you might see in this book here in the back, that interests me a lot I have to say, a year ago, definitely of that idea that we will never achieve that level where we are right now without understanding our brain better and without modeling neural networks closer to our brain work. So obviously I was wrong, but so were many others. But still, I think it's still a very interesting field, especially, if you look at spike neural networks and other things, where I think that modeling AI closer to the brain can give us, even if we don't make a leap forward anymore, because we are already very good at these language models, we can probably make it at a much cheaper point than we're doing now, rather than 1.7 trillion parameters, maybe 100 billion like our brain is, right? So do you think that this field of understanding our brain better and modeling AI closer to our brain has importance or significance in AI?
Yes, absolutely. It has importance, significance, it has value, and it should be absolutely done. As should be the opposite, right? I'm always appalled when people take extreme positions there, right? Because I mean, as always, the airplane is a good example, right? The airplane does not work like a plane, like a bird, but it's super
Yes.
useful, right? And but still, there was certainly inspiration from birds in doing so. Right? And for example, the human brain is of course very energy efficient. It's a good example. Right? You don't need to burn down a whole rainforest to train a human, right? While you need to do that with these large models these days. So that's a good example. But nevertheless, especially if you think of healthcare, right? The hope remains that we can go beyond human capabilities, and that's probably done with other technologies than the human works, right? There's so much pain and suffering in the world, right? And we have an obligation to reduce that if we can build systems, even if they are different than us and their intelligences are different than ours. If we can deploy them to help patients, we are morally obliged to do so. That leads a little bit back also to the explainability setting. Everything has to be done in settings to make sure it's safe and effective and equitable, but we should build this system. So yes, we will have intelligence airplanes that work very, very different than ours, right? And then we will certainly hopefully have systems that work similar to us for many practical reasons, but especially also scientific ones to understand ourselves better, right? Where we're coming, where we're going, how our brains work, elude these age-old questions you mentioned about sentience and consciousness and so forth. Maybe find out how propofol works at the end.
Well, exactly. I mean, that I wasn't even aware that we don't know this, to be honest. But yes, yeah, it is used like every day, so often, and we don't know. I mean, that is somewhat even shocking if you think about it, because you would assume that we know. But
No, it's actually true for many, many drugs, right?
yeah,
It's and that also leads us back to what we discussed before. The biological, physical world is just so enormously complex, right? And all this very much of the drug development, right? Since it doesn't matter if you test a herb that works grows in your forest, or you have a fancy drug that's developed in a lab. Very often, these are very shots in the dark and you see what sticks, right? That's how humans developed these drugs. We never understood how the herbs worked that grew back in our garden, right? And for many drugs, it's still not clear how they work. But if they are safe and if they are effective and they help, they should be used. And the same thing is true with AI.
thank you so much, Thomas. It was very, very interesting. Great work that you're doing. Great work, obviously, for even, I have to say it the way it is, even for humanity, because you're helping so many people with your research and with your technology. And I think one thing that you have certainly demonstrated, and I think that was very important when it comes to AI, is that AI is not just a scientific thing. You also have to marry it with an engineering practice, because you're dealing with so much data, with so much large systems, which you have found a very interesting way of achieving this. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Absolutely fabulous conversation and looking forward to the next one.
Thanks for listening to this edition of Hybrid Minds. This podcast is brought to you by Cognize, the first of its kind intelligent document processing company, which automates unstructured data with hybrid intelligence and a data-centric AI platform. To learn more, visit cognize.com. And be sure to catch the next episode of Hybrid Minds wherever you get your podcasts.